James Madison is often considered the father of the United States Constitution, though he himself attributed the work to the 55 delegates who attended the Federal Convention, and most prominently to the American people. The Constitution framed during the long, hot summer of 1787 at Philadelphia, he said, was the work of many heads and many hands. When the document was signed by all but 3 of the delegates present on September 17, 1787, Madison knew that the work of establishing a new Constitution had only just begun. The Constitution, he said, quote, was nothing more than a draft of a plan, nothing but a dead letter, until life and validity was breathed into it by the people of America, speaking through the several state conventions. Nonetheless, it is the case that no one among the founding generation thought through the question of Republican constitutionalism more than James Madison. He spent months in intensive scholarly research and preparation for the convention. Indeed, he spent a lifetime thinking about what it would take to establish a self-governing nation that could not only sustain itself, but do so in the spirit of justice and civic accord. Over time, his vision for America became sharper and more distinct. Indeed, he believed he had discovered a political model that would remedy the mortal diseases that had brought down republics throughout the centuries. Remember, republic, small r, is that word used from ancient times on. So Plato writes a book called The Republic, right? It could be a generic polity, or it could mean a popular government. With an excitement that is palpable, Madison declared that the Federal Republic of America is, quote, and this is shy, 5'4", 5'6", Jemmy Madison, who always dressed in black, and was so quiet that others always had to ask him to speak up in public gatherings. One Frenchman called him in a letter, Mr. Mutterson. This is this shy man, and this is what he writes. America is, quote, the government for which philosophy has been searching and humanity been sighing from the most remote ages. Such is the glory of America to have invented and her unrivaled happiness to possess, unquote. That's what he thought he discovered. What was that? Today, virtually all agree that America has, as the Irish would say, her troubles. Many Americans think our democracy is failing. Some think it has already failed. If Madison were alive and could witness the present condition of the nation, what would he think was the greatest threat to the Constitution? Admittedly, this question calls for a purely speculative response, but I think it might be helpful as a thought experiment. Remembering the past and recovering the ideas of one of the leading founders has the benefit of taking us out of our muddle today, at least for a moment, by situating the challenges we face today within a broader historical, political, and philosophic context in order to gain a clearer and perhaps richer perspective. If Madison were observing the current situation of America, I suspect he would identify 2 chief threats to the Constitution. The first looming threat has to do with what he perceived as the greatest danger to popular governments. That is, the problem of faction. Many of you are probably familiar with Madison's solution to the problem of faction. How many of you have read the Federalist Papers, or at least some of them? Let me see your hands way up. You got some good teachers here. Good. According to Madison, factions are opposed to the rights of some citizens or to the common good. When a majority composes a faction, power rather than right is the basis for rule. Since the causes of faction cannot be removed without destroying the liberty that fuels them or changing human nature, Madison advocated a political system that could control the effects of faction, including deterring the formation of majority faction. This would require constructing a socio-political environment in which communication of factious views can effectually be thwarted. In a small republic, Madison argued, it is easy for a majority to communicate and unite on the basis of selfish interests or prejudices, and thereby oppress the minority. By contrast, in an extensive or large republic, there will be a larger population, greater diversity of interests and religious views, a greater distance over which opinions must be communicated, and a greater distrust of unjust or dishonorable motives. This will make it more difficult for a majority faction to form on the basis of a narrow interest or harmful passion. In a large society, a coalition of the society will be necessary to achieve a majority. Thus, its demands will have to pass muster with a great variety of economic, geographical, religious, and other groups in society. As Madison understood, this would be no easy task. According to Madison, the task of representatives in popular government is, quote, to refine and enlarge the public views, unquote. Although he hoped elected officials would be men, quote, whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations, unquote. He was not naive about the temptations of power and ambition that accompany political life. He knew that, quote, enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, unquote. To guard against personal ambition and the threat of government tyranny, i.e. minority faction, Madison endorsed a system of prudential devices, including institutional separation of powers, bicameralism, checks and balances, and federalism. You'll recall that that's the theme, right, of Federalist 51. These inventions of prudence, as he put it, are intended to channel, check, and control the self-seeking personal motives of political office holders, and thereby enable government to police itself. Madison made clear in Federalist 51, however, that these safeguards against governmental tyranny are only, quote, auxiliary precautions. The primary control on the government, he said, remains always with the people. In the final analysis, governmental decisions depend on the will of the society, or in other words, for all practical intents and purposes, the will of the society is the will of the majority, because you don't expect unanimity, right? As Madison well understood, his proffered solution of the extended territory and representation diminishes the odds that a majority faction will gain ascendance or even form in the American Republic, but it does not forestall the possibility. If Americans, this is important, this is when you take notes in class, right? If Americans lack a consciousness about what constitutes unjust or dishonorable purposes, then a majority faction will not find it so difficult for its members to communicate their schemes and unite to oppress others in the society. If we don't know what's unjust, have any conception of that, or what's dishonorable, then this system doesn't work. This is the negative side of the Madisonian communication strategy. The other side wants to encourage, rather than just stymie, certain communications in order to shape and unite the will of the majority. Whereas too swift and facile political communication allows the mere will of the majority or sheer power to rule in the regime, slowing down the process and requiring discourse and effort to build agreement refines and enlarges the will of the society, or at least it has that tendency. Madison's goal then was to encourage the type of communicative activity that involves deliberation and results in the measured exchange of ideas about public matters. His object was to promote what he called, quote, a commerce of ideas, unquote, at the level of government and in fact throughout the entire society. And what he said was throughout the entire body of the American people. This is why, for example, he argued against a territory that is too small, as well as for one that is too large, instead calling for the just right size of a republic, or what he called a practicable sphere. If the territory is too small, majority factions easily form and oppress a minority. But if the society is too large, it would be difficult for citizens, at least in earlier centuries, to communicate effectively across so many miles, and so the public voice would be silenced. He wrote an article in 1791 entitled Public Opinion, and in it he said this: "Public opinion sets bounds to every government and is the real sovereign in every free one," unquote. That's the Madison who many scholars call anti-democratic. Let me read that again. "Public opinion sets bounds to every government and is the real sovereign in every free one." Sounds democratic to me. Madison meant by public opinion not Gallup polling type snapshots of the nation, demographically categorized, but rather the settled, authoritative opinion of the public that is produced over time via the complexly layered deliberative processes built into the American political system, which tend to filter out factious views and subject the remaining views to the built-in civic educational processes, both within the government and throughout the society. The formation of public opinion involves the influence of representatives and statesmen. It involves the influence of the literati, or what we today call public intellectuals, many of whom are public, but not necessarily intellectuals, and of the laws on the views of the people. Madison taught that it is not only the right, but, quote, the duty of intelligent and faithful citizens to discuss and promulgate political information and ideas freely in order to control government by the censorship of public opinion and according to the rules of the Constitution, unquote. Once formed and settled, however, public opinion is the authoritative voice that directs the measures of government. So you see, the idea is you filter opinion through, and those opinions may be passionate, narrowly interested, and it's going through a process through the representatives, but also among the citizens themselves throughout this large territory in op-eds, in public discussions, and so on. And so the representatives are beholden to that opinion, but it's not settled that easily, so they have a chance to influence it, right? Representatives who are going back to their constituents and arguing a particular point of view to see if they can build a consensus. And the ones who are courageous enough to do that, as opposed to put finger to the wind, right? But once that public opinion across the large territory is settled, the representatives have an obligation to obey it. What happens if they don't? They tend not to get elected in the next series of elections. Madison furthered his analysis of political communications in a large but practicable sphere by considering other factors that may act as equivalents to a contraction of the territorial limits. He's looking ahead. What other things can make the regime that right size? He said, well, we could grow larger if there are things that counteract the size. And what are these things? These include transportation routes, domestic commerce, and a free press that circulates throughout the entire body of the people. And he said, quote, representatives going from and returning among every part of them, unquote. Via this multi-layered process, then, Madison devised a system of politics in which the interests and passions of the public are regulated by the government, and in turn, the government is controlled and regulated by what he called the reason of the public. In sum, Madison's solution is mechanistic only in the sense that institutional arrangements encourage the clash of political interests and ambitions and views. thereby slowing down the legislative process. This design simultaneously establishes a milieu that calls representatives to act as statesmen and literati to enlist their fellow citizens in the exchange of ideas. It summons thoughtful citizens in both the public and private sectors to take up the task of civic education, engage in the art of argumentation and persuasion, and pursue the refinement and enlargement of the public views. Indeed, civic leaders have a responsibility to their fellow citizens in service to the highest political and human ends, to act as, and these are Madison's words, quote, the cultivators of the human mind, the manufacturers of useful knowledge, the agents of the commerce of ideas, the censors of public manners, the teachers of the arts of life and means of happiness, unquote. As critically important as statesmen and literati are in Madison's design for civic education in the American Republic, however, it cannot be too much emphasized that his ultimate reliance is not upon either of these elite minority groups within society, no more than it is upon the institutions of government. The ruling authority, the final say in all free governments, he clearly pronounced, is public opinion, which for all practical intents and purposes is the opinion of the majority. In Vices of the Political System, the notes he wrote in preparation for the Constitutional Convention of 1787, he said this: in Republican government, the majority, however composed, ultimately give the law, unquote. In the final analysis, then, there is no substitute for the defect of better motives in the citizenry. As William B. Allen has so unequivocally put it, quote, there is no provision that can be written down concerning the government that can actually make government free. The condition of free government is that there is a free people, unquote. Republican government is sustained only by citizens who are committed to and practice the Republican way of life, period. Robert Frost captured Madison's vision of the Constitution of America as a land of just rule based on the capacity for self-government in his poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, and also in his poem, The Gift Outright. In elaborating on this theme at talks he gave in 1955 and 56, a little before some of your time, at Dartmouth and Sarah Lawrence College, respectively, he alluded to the cliched idea of the American dream. What is a dream, he asked? It gets thrown in my face every now and then, whether there was a dream and whether it's just a dream of materialism and whether it's gone by. Have we dreamed it away, Frost asked. Well, he said, I've been reading the Federalist Papers lately, and I think there's something to that thing called the American dream. And I think the best dreamer of it was Madison. Frost said, Madison dreamed of a nation in self-control. That is all through his writings, he said, a nation in which the people are in self-control. The dream, he said, is to occupy a new land with a people capable of governing themselves. At Dartmouth, he played and joked with his audience about that last stanza in Stopping by the Woods poem. But I have promises to keep. You know that. But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. And he played with that, and he joked around, and he said, I've been asked so many times what it means, and so I thought I'd make something up for you. Of course, there was nothing quick or careless about these lines in the poem or about Frost's meaning. The promises I have to keep, Frost said that day, are of two kinds. Those I make for myself and those the founding generation made for me in the form of a social contract. In other words, the second kind of promise is the civic pledge that he made, that in fact all of us make, explicitly or implicitly, tacitly, which is at once an oath to our country, but even more importantly than the oath to our country is our promise to our fellow citizens to respect their rights and capacity for self-government in the way that we ask them to respect ours. Concerned about the kind of ideas that were promised, prominent in his classes at Harvard, which he stayed there for a while but didn't finish up, such as that the Declaration of Independence was virtually meaningless. One of his teachers called it, one of Frost's teachers called it a salad of ideas, this and that, and not much of anything. That Frost, and also concerned about things that he read, for example, in Spengler's Crisis of the West, or witnessed in the political struggles of the 1950s, Robert Frost believed that Madison's dream for America was in jeopardy. How then are we today to assess the status of the Constitution and of Madison's vision for America? Has it gotten worse? Has it gone by? And if so, how much worse and why? Obviously, various historical, technological, and political changes that have occurred since the founding era have substantially altered the operation of our system. What is true, while it is true that Madison witnessed or anticipated a number of advances in travel and communication technology, he was still alive when the steam engine came in, because he was the last of the men at the Constitutional Convention to die in 1836. He could have hardly imagined the extent of change that was on the horizon. In the 18th and 19th century, the amount of time required to build a national constitutional majority was largely contingent on the size of a nation, that is, contingent on space. The effect of space upon time produced an environment conducive to deliberative politics in 18th century America. You know where I'm going. What about in our time? Does space affect time? With the internet, Facebook, Twitter, instant messaging, Instagram, space is unable to affect time in order to produce an environment conducive to political deliberation. Today, no matter the territorial distance, the speed of communication is almost instantaneous. In Madison's scheme, this connection between space and time on the one hand is related to a connection between reason and passion on the other hand. The process of refining, enlarging, and modifying the public passions into the reason of the public is in part contingent on the effect of spatial on temporal factors. With advances in communications technology and the negation of the impact of distance on slowing the formation of public opinion, one of the chief elements in Madison's plan to achieve the cool and deliberate sense of the community is now lacking. This change has prompted some to ask if our current political problems are, at least in part, a result of social media. And what of not only the speed and contagion of views, often prejudicial views, but the vitriol that too often characterizes exchanges on Facebook, Twitter, and so forth, especially vicious in some anonymous posts, yes? Just as an aside, consider how this fact makes Madison's claim about the stultifying effect of the large territory upon those with dishonorable views. If you're anonymous, it's not going to have that effect. How much are the political problems of our time the result of the unfettered flow, even perhaps contagion of public passions and interests across the nation by these new and instant forms of communication? Given Madison's theory of ease of communication as the equivalent of a contraction of the territory, remember he gives us examples of that, what makes a territory for all practical intents smaller. The large republic has now become, once again, the small republic. If the extended republic was the first part of Madison's solution to the problem of faction, representation was the second. The refusal of the contemporary Congress to do its job as the deliberative legislative body, instead abdicating much of its lawmaking responsibility to the bureaucracy, also contributes to the ineffectiveness of the Madisonian model. In 2022, we are once again faced with the old challenge of how to remedy the disease of that most dangerous vice, faction. We are called upon to rethink Madisonian republicanism, just as he had to rethink classical republicanism. Now, partly, but not wholly due to social media, the nation has become increasingly divided into two groups, warring over the political future of the nation. What about the growth of independent voters in recent years, you might ask? Doesn't this counteract the bipolarization of our national politics? In fact, there are now more independent voters than either Democrats or Republicans. Right now, there's 29 people are registered, 29% Democrat, 28% Republican, 41% independent, according to a recent Gallup poll. But here's the rub. The vast majority of independents lean either towards the Democrat or the Republican Party, and, quote, in their political attitudes and views of most issues, they are in general agreement with those who affiliate with that same party. So they won't register as Republican or Democrat, but they take the side of one or the other. Thus, the leading cause of fissure for most Americans, of whatever party or affiliation or non-affiliation, is not race, ethnicity, class, religion, age, sex, or geographic region. Rather, it's political principles or ideology. And the intensity of the disagreement is such that each side sees the other as hateful and threatening the common good of the country. We have our troubles. On the one side, progressive Democrats envision a sea of red-capped heads draped in the flag, chanting, "Stop the steal." While not all conservatives or Republicans are Trump supporters, most on the right took umbrage recently when President Biden accused Trump and Republicans of embracing political violence and being semi-fascist. Whatever semi-fascism is. I don't know. Biden says Trump and MAGA Republicans are, quote, a threat to our very democracy. Trump says Biden is an enemy of the state. Tit for tat. However much the two sides disagree with each other, there is one thing they do agree on, in addition to their mutual dislike of one another, and that is that the nation is on a collision course. As the inimitable P.G. Wodehouse might have said about our situation, we are in the soup. Despite the nation's halcyon days at the moment, we Americans look like a people who had drunk the cup of life and found a dead beetle at the bottom. If you happen to know Wodehouse's Mike and Smith series, that is Smith with a P, P-S-M-I-T-H, but the P is silent, you'll have to admit that Joe Biden can sometimes be a little bit like Smith with a P. One of the Georges said Smith with a P, I forgot which, once said that a certain number of hours sleep a day, I cannot recall for the moment how many, made a man something, which for the time being has slipped my memory. However, there you are. I've given you the main idea of the thing. But turnabout is fair play. Donald Trump doesn't fare any better at the hands of P.G. Wodehouse, for he looks more like a lobster than most lobsters do. As good a medicine as it is to joke a bit about our current situation, we can't put our heads in the sand and just hope it will improve. We have to face the reality that the people of America think their country is dying. According to a January 2022 poll by NPR, 64% of Americans believe U.S. democracy, quote, is in crisis and at risk of failing, quote, unquote. A recent Harvard Youth poll that surveys young Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 revealed that, quote, more than half of young Americans feel democracy in the country is under threat. In addition, a bare 7% of American youth see the United States as a healthy democracy, while 52% think that the democracy is either in trouble or failing. Of those surveyed, 35% think that they will witness a civil war during their lifetimes. 35% of people in your age group, most of you here, think that they will see a civil war in the United States in their lifetime. How many people here think that you may see a civil war in your lifetime? The hands are slowly going up. But on the whole, Villanovans are more optimistic than Harvard. We have to remember that Generation Z has only really known post-9/11 America, a nation under attack from abroad and severely divided from within. Still, this is hardly comforting news. Are the views of the respondents to this survey basically your views or not? Do you think America is failing? Not surprisingly, America's youth is fraught with some, but not all, of the internal dissensions that the older generations are. Of those surveyed in the 2022 Harvard Youth poll, 59% of young Democrats and 61% of young Republicans, pretty close, view the other party as a threat to democracy. While 74% of likely voting Democrats and 68% of likely voting Republicans, these are the youth, see the other party as a threat to democracy. That's pretty high. We've talked about the great divide in the nation, but what is the disagreement actually about? What is it about? And why is it so intense as to produce such animosity towards others? It goes without saying that some of what is going on is fueled by Donald Trump, by either hatred of him or antipathy toward those who attack him and what he purports to stand for. Well, much of the screechiness in the dispute is raised even another octave higher when Trump is part of the conversation. The polarization of America goes deeper than Donald Trump. Think of, for example, Bernie Sanders, AOC, the House Progressive Caucus, and virtually anyone from urban Massachusetts on the one hand. And on the other hand, think of Tom Cotton, Ron DeSantis, the House Freedom Caucus. What's at stake in this rivalry? And then there's the newly popularized form of critical theory called critical race theory, which categorizes all whites as privileged and prejudiced oppressors, whether consciously or subconsciously. This is part of what is known as social justice and being woke, which all of you are certainly familiar with. Anybody here not familiar with that? Not one hand. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are the magic words, which apply not only to race, but ethnicity, gender, and myriad types of sexual identity. On the other side of this battle are, well, I guess, the non-woke, or maybe we'll call them the sleepers, who cling to their guns, religion, traditional family values, and old notions of individual rights and responsibilities, rather than what they see as a form of tribalism. This has led, among other things, to what is called the cancel culture clash. Now, as much as the political divide in the United States has the look of a partisan rivalry, I think the dispute is much deeper than party labels or public policy differences. It's a dispute over the meaning of the American Constitution. Stay with me on this. In the sense of what constitutes the nation, not just that parchment, the American Constitution in the sense of what constitutes, what makes up the nation, what constitutes our way of life and gives it a particular character. At bottom, on one side of this quarrel, are those who believe that there is an eternal standard of right and wrong, whether ordained by God, discovered in nature, or both. In essence, these folks are part of a long tradition of belief in the idea of a moral universe, whose precepts might be called natural law or natural right, or in other cultures, perhaps the Tao. More on that in a moment. On the other side of the disagreement are people who reject the notion of natural law and the idea of nature qua nature, that is, of a permanent, unchanging moral standard of right that exists independent of human will or preference. In its stead, this side sees personal and social identities as constructs, freely created and infinitely changeable. As such, morality is not grounded in eternal principles of right and wrong, but rather is evolving, indefinite, diverse, inclusive, radically freeing, and beautifully limitless in the postmodern technological world. Plasticity takes the place of essence. The human being is replaced by the transhuman. According to David Brooks, the phrase moral freedom captures a prominent progressive perspective in politics and ethics. For these progressives, quote, the individual conscience is the ultimate authority. In a diverse society, each person should have the right to lead her own authentic life and make up her own mind about moral matters. For example, if a woman decides to get an abortion, then we should respect her freedom of choice. If a teenager concludes they are non-binary or decides to transition to another gender, then we should celebrate their efforts to live a life that is authentic to who they really are. In this ethos, society would be rich with a great diversity of human types. As Charles Taylor puts it, quote, everyone has their own way of being human, unquote. This brings us face to face with what Madison would see as the second greatest threat to the Constitution today. And here again, I mean Constitution with a small c, as in the minds and mores, the beliefs, the habits, the loves, the likes, the dislikes of the American people, our way of life, what constitutes who we are. We recall that Madison's definition of faction hinges on the distinction between what is just and what is unjust, or what is morally right and what is wrong. In Federalist 51, he declared, justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. The justice he spoke of in this essay should be read in the context of the principles of justice that he highlighted in Federalist 39, namely, quote, the principles of the American Revolution, unquote. And these principles, of course, are the principles expressed in the Declaration of Independence. As you know, Madison and the founders believed that all men are by nature equal and possess natural rights, and that a just government is based on consent, limited in scope, and committed to securing the rights and liberties of the citizens. We've heard that before. Madison understood human beings to possess reason, albeit fallible reason, which is prone to the influence of selfish passions and partial interests. Think about it. Have you ever been influenced in your life by what you think because of something you want? Or something that you feel strongly about? That's what Madison is saying. Opinions, passions, and interests. These are the latent causes of faction that Madison says in Federalist 10 are sown in the nature of man. For Madison and the founding generation, politics is fundamentally about the struggle between reason and the selfish passions, between right and wrong, between the laws of nature and of nature's God on the one hand, and mere interest or power on the other hand. It's not a very different view than you read in the opening of Plato's Republic. Lincoln would agree with this assessment, as revealed so vividly in the close of his Lyceum address. So would Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan. What for them made America exceptional in some way or another was not so much what we've accomplished, though the progress achieved that we have achieved, they would not think unimportant. But what's really important is the end sought by America, an end worthy of unrelenting labor and immense sacrifice. That end, or standard, was the standard of justice, what Lincoln called the standard maxim of free society, and I quote Lincoln here, which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and therefore constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all peoples of all colors, everywhere, unquote. Careful readers of the Federalist will see that they cannot understand what Publius is really up to without understanding why his solution to the problem of faction is not simply to control faction, but to break, this is his word, break the violence of faction. Let us recall Publius's description of the problem in the very first sentence of Federalist 10, quote, among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction, unquote. We cannot begin to understand the problem of faction the way Madison understood it without imagining the political problem writ large. That problem, that violence, is the unspeakable injustices and brutalities that groups of human beings have done to other human beings since the dawn of time, often in the name of their higher class or superior identity, and hardly less often in the name, at least, of justice. But for Madison, the standard of justice that is infused into the Constitution, infused into it, and its processes and its principles and its spirit, and infused into the American way of life, comes not from the mere will or momentary preferences of people, but from a symmetrical, eternal nature of which human nature is a part. He wrote a piece called Symmetry of Nature. Indeed, the people, in all of their power, have the obligation to work in tandem with the laws of nature that are, in fact, the very basis of their rights and of their legitimate claim to power. Madison would have seen the rejection of the natural right foundation of the American Republic as a rejection of the core of America. This would have been his view. For Madison and the founders in general, there is simply no substitute for natural right. Or in the uniquely American context, there's no substitute for the principle that all men are created equal by their very nature, and for the moral implications that flow from this principle. As I mentioned, there are various names for some amount of variation on the theme of natural right, however, including natural law and the Tao. C.S. Lewis clearly and forcefully stated the choice before us today as we attempt to navigate a world divided by the clash between natural right on the one hand and progressive historicism on the other. Here's what Lewis said. The Tao, which others may call natural law, or traditional morality, or first principles, or practical reason, or first platitudes, is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole source of all value judgments. If it is rejected, all value is rejected, unquote. In other words, if we reject the natural standard of right that has informed the purpose of America since its beginning, then all we are left with is a morality without morals, or tribal power politics. Alistair McIntyre, whom my husband rather likes, calls a progressive conception of moral freedom or conscience emotivism. In other words, what is morally right is whatever feels right to me. Moreover, this completely secularized, individualized conception of conscience, shorn of its connection with the human capacity to reason, is hardly more than self-indulgence crowned by self-righteousness. This is one step deeper and darker into the human inner essence, where Madison's latent causes of faction are sown. I use the term, quote, inner essence, or I might have used the term authentic self here because these are the progressive terms that would recast and transform the traditional idea of the soul and its place in the flourishing of humanity. In Madison's scheme, without a standard of right independent of mere human will or group will, there's no basis for condemning faction or any practice of injustice because there's no basis to distinguish right from wrong or just from unjust or honor from dishonor. It goes without saying, but still seems like it should be said, that since the beginning and still today, the principles that inform the nation's purpose have not always been manifest in the practices of the nation. So while good principles do not dictate good practices, still, it's in the good principles, it's the good principles that teach us to condemn and break the bad practices. The 2020s are not the first time the contours of the American nation have become blurred and distorted, putting in question the citizens' commitment to its cause, its purpose, and creating severe uncertainty about whether we would succeed or fail, about what would become of us. What will become of us? Surely the 1850s were such a time, and perhaps even the 1790s. For now, we rest uneasy as we navigate dangerous night seas. But we cannot lose hope or give up on the American dream of a land of self-government or that republic for which philosophy has been searching and humanity sighing from time immemorial. That's what losers do. No one promised it'd be easy or that the work was even finished. In fact, after Madison donned the American Republic as the answer to the size of humanity, he immediately reminded his readers that it was not perfect, that more would need to be done, not only to improve it, but to meet new exigencies in the years ahead. He said, quote, "May her glory be completed by every improvement on the theory which experience may teach, and her happiness be perpetuated by a system of administration corresponding with the purity of the theory." He said there's work left for us. Things will change. We'll have to meet new challenges. The promises Robert Frost talked about are not promises we receive, but promises we make. By accepting the mantle of citizenship, we have each promised to treat each other as true equals with the respect due to humanity. This is a promise each one of us, of every generation, must make to our fellow citizens without qualification. A long time ago, the land we called America was ours before we were the land's. She was our land before we were her people. I do not know what will become of this land or whether the people who inhabit it will remain her people. What I do know is that the days ahead will not be easy, and it is especially in the hard days, in the most difficult, confused, and distorted of times, that we have to work for the cause of our land as if there is no possibility of failure. And then let this defiant hope bring some real modicum of patience and forbearance for others. For as Frost subtly reminds and advises us, sometimes America is hard to see. Thank you.
Dr. Sheehan will now take questions. If you have questions for Dr. Sheehan, you just hold your hand up and she can call on you. If you'd like to project from where you're standing, that's fine. Otherwise, I can come to you with the microphone.
So I just have a quick question. You said at the beginning that Madison said that there were two threats to the Constitution. The first one was factions, and what was the second one?
The second one is more complex. It's what constitutes us. What do we believe in? Do we believe in the core principles of this land we call America? For Madison, all of the scheme that he develops with representation, the large territory, all the things you see in the Constitution, the three branches of government, the processes, all these things, this all has a purpose. It's not just government should always look this way. It looks this way for a reason. And that reason is to create a back and forth to slow things down, to refine and enlarge public opinion, the public views. But towards what? Towards what? To make these views, to take out, to weed out factious or unjust views, the kind of views that harm other people, that are unfair to other people, that are oppressive of other people's rights. And so if we're a nation today that doesn't believe that rights have any grounding, rights are anything you want them to be because you like it or don't like it. If there isn't any such thing really as things that we owe to human beings because they're human, if to be human can mean anything and everything, and so nothing is right and nothing is wrong, then what's the purpose of that system? What is it supposed to be doing? It becomes meaningless. It's nothing more than really anarchy, isn't it? Or maybe we're a tribe for a while before we completely split apart, but it's power. It's power instead of right. And Madison's whole schema, he says in preparation for the Constitutional Convention, is that how to place power on the side of right, how to make the majority a just majority. But if there's no such thing as justice, a right, then it doesn't make, none of that makes any sense at all. It would make no sense at all to Madison. He would see that as the greatest threat to the American way of life, to the whole reason of being of America. It loses its meaning. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry. There was recently a Pew Research study about the decline of Christianity and modeling over the next 30 years. And that made me think a lot about the quote from John Quincy Adams about our government not being capably used from the irreligious and immoral people. And I wonder whether or not you could, with talking about Christianity and Judeo-Christian values as being the sort of undergirding idea of what motivates the United States, how the perhaps modeling decline of Christianity would be relevant for this discussion or this point that you're positing. That do you see anything of an outgrowth in that?
Yeah, thank you for that really good question, and hard question. I saw that Pew study, and in fact, David Brooks, in the article I was quoting here, talks about that. And what he says is those on the side of, the idea of traditional morality and religion and family concerns. He says in the next election, they probably got the upper hand, but they're in an existential crisis because everything they believe is declining, even among their own children. And so that's the way America is going. Doesn't matter. I don't think America is built on one particular religion. I I think that that's a reason for the First Amendment and religious liberty. However, is there any such thing as a nation of philosophers who don't need law because they've already figured it out? So just from a practical perspective, most people get their sense of right and wrong, if they have a sense, from religion. That's part of the reason why there's a decline in that today, because there's a decline in religion that goes hand in hand with a decline in thinking that there are any kind of eternal standards of right and wrong. But remember, I mean, here at Villanova, of all places, we should realize that that's not the only way we can come to understand. That's an important way. And certainly for believers, that is the most important way, yes. But there's also, Thomas Aquinas said this thing called natural law that's open to everyone by our very humanity to reason through those things. When you reject both of those things, what are you left with? I don't know of any nation that, Madison's Federalist 49 is about that. Because you can't expect a nation of all. He's really thinking the French. You know, they changed their churches into, you know, pottery studios or something, right? Because they don't need them anymore. And so, how do you expect to, well, what do you do when you go to court and you take an oath to tell the truth? If none of that means anything, the whole system falls apart. So between, from a political perspective, let alone the perspective of faith, which is another entire question, it really puts us in a difficult and dangerous, extremely dangerous situation if all of those things that are the basis for decent government are no longer believed. Look, folks, we live in a world that is changing so rapidly, and you're part of it. You don't even know what came before unless you are here, and maybe you're reading it in some of your classes, and it seems like history to you. Those people who used to believe those things. Where are you going in a world that doesn't think there's anything to believe? Except for what you make up. Is that enough? And especially if you can make up anything and everything. What's your neighbor going to make up? And how's that going to affect you? Are you the creator of all values in the universe? Is that all there is to all of this? If it is, why is there government at all? What's it supposed to do? How are you supposed to live with each other? How do you do that? Now, this is not a good enough argument that I'm giving you, saying you're in trouble if you don't have any beliefs. That's only one part. The really hard part is to figure out if there are things to believe. You can't believe in them just because you need them. That's not enough. But are you willing to ask the question, show me why there's something to believe in. Challenge each other and your faculty members and yourself. At least ask the question before knowing the answer. Yeah? Paul?
Did Madison have an idea of the size of government when he was writing, or did he think that was all-encompassing, that the solutions to all of the ills of society should fall into government?
No. No, Madison was very much a limited government fellow. So remember, he gets in a fight with Hamilton right away in the first administration of government under Washington because he wants strict construction. No national bank, he didn't call for it, it wasn't in the enumerated powers. Madison wants strict construction. And he wants a lot of, the power that's left to the states, he wants left to the states. So, yeah, no, he doesn't think government is a solution. At all. Dr. Apple.
I have a practical question to ask about the operation of the focus of government in light of the presentation, which, oh, sorry, I I said it's a practical question, and it comes to my mind because of the statement you made early on, that in this Republican system, the ruling authority is public opinion, which is a perfectly sound statement, I believe. I believe it reflects accurately what Madison believes. But it raises a question in light of many things that we practice and believe today. I will illustrate this. It is common for us to look at various regimes across the face of the earth and to conduct opinion polls of the citizens in those regimes and ask one question in particular. Do the people trust their governments? And we take the answer to that question, if it's affirmative, as establishing the legitimacy of the government. And so we can say we work with a practical rule that we measure governmental legitimacy by the extent to which the people trust their governments. But if the ruling authority is public opinion, I wonder if, practically speaking, the rule shouldn't be inverted. That, in fact, the government is Republican only to the extent that the government trusts the citizens. Now, I ask that question particularly in an era in which we're counseled, generally speaking, to trust the experts in the government. How do you respond?
You're going to be shocked, but I'm going to say that I completely agree with you. Shocked? This gentleman is not only an old friend, he's my teacher. So, and we don't always agree on everything, but I think I'm fundamentally, you know that there's that piece by Madison where he actually raises that question because this is exactly the debate in the 1790s. The old way of thinking about government with the sort of elites, we call them elites today, ruling, who have deference, was that the people, even if you're going to have a free government, a popular government, people would elect those, not too often, put them in power, let them do their jobs. And Alexander Hamilton had that view of government. And it's called confidence in government. That the people should have trust or confidence in government. He reads some of this in Hume and other places. And Madison's response to that is, that's not, oh, you got it wrong, Hamilton. He doesn't say his name, but he's talking to him, I think, and others. And he says, that's not how it works. That you put people in government and then you submit and obey. You have confidence, you submit and obey. You know, what you do is you put people in as representatives in government, and you watch them, and you have vigilance, and you look over and you see what you do, and make sure that they institute, essentially, the deliberate will of the people. And that's what you have confidence in and submit to. So, I mean, yeah, it's not about trust in government. It's about trust in ourselves. And right now, we don't have that. How do we get it back?
Zach.
Well, part of it is a matter of our what we actually choose to believe. Not just, yeah, I mean, part of it is your view of these things. Yeah. Oh.
This is not a question, it's a comment. And it's answering the question that you just asked, which is how do we get it back? And I would say one of the ways we get it back is by creating opportunities to listen to someone who, with such clarity, outlines for us the dangers and the challenges. So thank you so much for doing that.
Oh, thank you.